Well, hey everybody, Jonathan Doyle with you once again. Welcome back to the Daily Message. Please, of course, make sure you've subscribed. If you like these short daily updates, then please hit that subscribe button. And also, leave some comments as well, topics that you're interested in, things that you want to know more about from each of the daily videos. So please use the comments section, or if you're hearing this on the podcast, there's plenty of contact details there as well. There should be a link just underneath here to getting yourself free access to my book, Bridging the Gap. I'm going to send you a chapter every sort of 48 hours. For a few days, you get to go through the entire book. So please do yourself a favor, hit the link wherever you're hearing or watching this and grab yourself free access to my Bridging the Gap book. It's the book that started it all for me. I think it was the first book I wrote, maybe it was the second, but it'll be there in the bio and in the details here for you. So go grab yourself a copy. Today, I'm going to share with you an insight from the great Roman statesman Seneca the Elder, born in 64 BC in Hispania, which was at that time a Roman province. It's what we would today call modern-day Spain. And he's one of the sort of great writers of that particular period, just a little bit before Caesar Augustus, but just one of the great minds of history, one of the great thinkers of history. And over these next few videos this week, I'm going to be focusing on some of these great historical figures. I've got a classical heart. I just love the sort of classical era, teaching my kids at the moment all about sort of classical world history. And it's just fascinating to see how these men and women, we emerge from that kind of long time in human history of kind of tribalism and hand-to-mouth survival, and then we see these first civilizations begin to emerge, coming out of places like the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt. You know, in world history, these civilizations are actually pretty young. I mean, ancient Egypt's really only about sort of 4,500, 5,000 years old, which I know sounds like a long time, but in terms of like world history and cosmic history, it's a pretty short space of time. But it's fascinating when you study these civilizations and you see that they begin to emerge, and you see that it's the first time that we have men and women with enough safety and free time to begin to think about the world around them. It's really quite an interesting moment in human history, because before that, everything was really literally about survival. It was about food, and it was about killing other people before they killed you. So it's only quite recent. I mean, you could look at classical Greece 2,500 years ago and sort of see that as the first time that we really began to sit and think about reality. Trust me, there were still people doing lots of farming, hunting, killing, doing all that sort of stuff, but there was this little subset of people that began to think. And I don't know if you'd agree, but in our modern world at the moment, it's hard, isn't it, to get time for really unstructured thinking. I drove down the coast 2 days ago to see a friend, and I went up and back in the day, and it was like, I just loved it. It was just like, on the way down, there was all this fog, and it was cold and raining. I just thought. I just sat in the car on my own and thought my thoughts. So I've always been like that. You know, one of the great things about traveling over the last few years has been being in a lot of the world's great cities and just walking and walking. I remember being in London pre-COVID and just walking for days. I had 2 or 3 day gaps between big events, and I just walk and think. And then a couple of years ago, I was in Washington and walked down to Arlington Cemetery, went to the grave of people like John F. Kennedy, and just fascinating to walk around these cities and just think. So I'm on a tangent now, but basically what I'm talking about is how important it is to get time to think. It's a really unusual moment in history that we're living in, because the level of bombardment of technology is quite extraordinary, right? There's just so much coming at us. You know, I've begun to really turn my phone off for long periods of time during the day, and then turning it off early in the evenings. You know, I used to get up super early, and like most of us, I'd have my coffee machine ready to go, and I'd be scrolling through news and checking email while making my coffee at like 3:30, 4 a.m. I'd be there and I've begun to stop that and really get some discipline, because I think one of the most important things we can do is begin to give ourselves time to actually think and to ask ourselves some important questions about what matters to us. This is part of the path of personal development, is to genuinely think, is to actually pause and reflect and go internal and think about what actually matters to me, what's important. Am I living on autopilot? All right, there's just some random opening thoughts because we're going to now jump into this quote as promised from Seneca the Elder. Born in 64 BC, writing in about sort of 40, sort of between 30 and 40 BC. I guess he died at the age of 56, so life expectancy back then was pretty short. Now I'm doing it again. I'm going off another tangent. I'm going to stop and we're going to jump into this quote. Let's do it. We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality. My precious regular listeners, you know how often I'm on this kind of tangent about perspective and how thoughts shape our experience of reality. So he's reminding us here of two key things. There's two clauses in this statement. Number one is that we are more often frightened than we are hurt. So often in life, in terms of things like physical pain, they're relatively rare. I mean, some of you know I had my major big accident about 3 years ago now and almost died and destroyed both arms and had a bunch of surgery. But that came out of nowhere. It wasn't like for months beforehand I was worrying about something happening to me. Often when we experience, physical pain, it's often out of nowhere. But being frightened, being anxious, being concerned and worried about things is something that many of us have really cornered the market on. And then this, the second clause where he talks about that so much of the suffering is what happens in our imagination. That we have an incredible capacity to invent suffering that we don't actually have to experience. How many times in your life have you created a scenario of something terrible happening that never happened? Example being, look at the global hysteria over COVID, which is essentially, as it always was, a airborne respiratory virus that posed a genuine threat to the very elderly, the very frail, and morbidly obese, right? But we did manage to shut down an entire planet and destroy huge numbers of livelihoods, families, and careers in the process. We seem to be really good at manufacturing things to be morbidly afraid of. I used to say to my kids, I said, look, I'll tell you when I'm going to start worrying about COVID. When I see bodies in the streets, that's when I'm going to start worrying. If I don't see the bodies in the streets, then I'm going to have a pretty healthy skepticism and do a lot of research about what's actually going on. All right, another tangent, but you can tell where my heart is on some of this stuff, that not only can we freak ourselves out individually, but we get really good at freaking ourselves out as a culture. And one of the reasons is because we're highly attuned to fear. You've got to understand that. We are highly attuned as a species to fear. Fear had a really fantastic evolutionary advantage, didn't it? Because the people that were more anxious often lived a lot longer, right? The people that were a bit more relaxed about the bear, the saber-toothed tiger, the other tribe, people are going, what if that other tribe was attacked us? It was the Optimist that got killed, right? He's like, that tribe, they're great. They're not going to do anything to us. They seem so friendly. They're always chanting and yelling and having fires and stuff and all that human sacrifice. What could possibly go wrong? It's going to be fine. Meanwhile, the anxious person is like, you know what? I'm just going to move a little further over. So I often joke that you don't want an optimistic airline pilot, right? You don't want an optimistic airline pilot. You don't want an airline pilot that's like, nah, it's going to be fine. This storm. Well, it'll be fine. We'll land the plane. I'm just going to have a little rest. You want a kind of skeptical, quasi-semi-anxious pilot. Not too anxious because then they can overcompensate. But you get my point. There are some things that we need a little bit of healthy concern over, right? But our modern culture serves up so many possibilities. Like, things to be anxious about. I do a huge amount of stuff in the economics, global macro finance space, right? So I've got a real interest in global banking systems, macro finance, that sort of stuff. And you look at inflation at the moment. Inflation's a real thing. It's having real impacts on people. But it's also, I don't want to minimize it because I actually think it is something that has genuine effects. But, people living in prehistoric tribal societies weren't really concerned about abstract concepts like inflation. But in our world, these things just get served up all the time, right? Like, inflation, it's probably running about real inflation is probably running about 8 or 9% at the time of recording this. In my parents, I remember them talking about inflation being at 19, 20% when I was a young kid. So these things happen and they're real, but they can really start to grind us down and wear us down. So let's make it relevant for you. You've got to get really good at discerning between what is a reasonable, rational anxiety or something that you should have some concern about, as opposed to the vast number of things that other people would like us to be afraid about. Why? Because our fear is essentially a commodity, right? You can trade it in a sense that we trade fear for attention. So if media organizations and governments serve up fear, it attracts attention, and attention can lead us to doing all sorts of behaviors, right? From being obedient when we probably need to be more reflective about what's appropriate for us as individuals. It can be things like making us consume and buy things that we might not otherwise have not consumed or bought. So I think we've got to get really good at filtering the fear messaging that's coming at us. And just as you go through your daily life, start to think a little bit more about, hang on, is this thing I'm afraid of really likely to happen? Like really likely to happen? Because I think so much of our suffering happens on the way to the dentist, right? So much of our suffering happens about things that we think might happen but never actually do happen. Okay, so that's it for today. Seneca's reminding us that real pain is pretty rare. We suffer much more in our imagination than in reality. I mean, really, it's a pretty amazing time to be alive, right? As I said a couple of weeks ago in an episode, if you're living in an era with flushing toilets, historically, that's a pretty big win. I mean, yeah, we got interest rates and other stuff, and I'm not minimizing some of the real stuff that's going on in the world. But if you were going to be born at any time in history, it's not too bad. I used to never think about things like medical care. I was like, yeah, shmeh. I was always pretty fit. I don't think about it for me, but now that I got a family, you start to go, yeah, it's pretty awesome that we've got hospitals and we've got medical insurance. And so there's these really amazingly great things that make living at this moment pretty historically amazing. So those are things worth focusing on and celebrating and enjoying and valuing. But let's start to get much more attuned to the fears that aren't really fears. So what are you afraid of in your life at the moment? Is it loneliness? Single people can be afraid of they never find the right person. Married people can be going, oh my gosh, I've got to spend the rest of my life with this person. So, and we can construct all these different fears instead of actually working on ourselves, working on improving our relationships, improving our health, improving our education, improving our contribution. So I would just suggest to you, my friends, spend a whole lot less time on worrying about abstract things that may or may not happen. And always remember, death is a random thing. We all have this illusion that we're just going to live forever and ever and ever and die peacefully in our beds at 95. But there is a bit to be said for the mindset that goes, you know what? I'm just going to try and live today as fully as I can. I'm not going to worry too much about the future. I'm just going to try and enjoy today as fully as I can. So, friends, there's a lot in that today. It's a little bit longer than I'd normally go. Hope it's useful. Go and audit yourself. Audit your irrational fears. And just start working and taking action on the things you can actually take action on. All right, that's it from me. Please make sure you're subscribed. Hit that subscribe button. Grab yourself free access to the Bridging the Gap program. There's other stuff here about booking me to come and speak at your organization, conference, and also coaching with me. So check out those links. All right, that's it. My name's Jonathan Doyle. Thanks for the pleasure of your company, and I'm going to have another video for you or podcast, depending on where you're listening, tomorrow.